Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me properly? Thank you.
Munmi, please unmute yourself first.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Munmi Bora. Uh, I am teaching at Bahana College. I am the moderator for this session. First of all, I would like to welcome our resource person, Dr. Samir Kumar Das, IQAC cell coordinators, and all the faculties of Bahana College, along with our participants, to this week-long online workshop on research methodology for ethnographic studies, and particularly to today's session on methodology for ethnographic research, organized by IQAC Cell, Bahana College in collaboration with Sutia Jatiya Gobehana Porishod. As you all know, Northeast has become a hub for ethnographic researches. So, ethnographic research comprises bundle of methods or multiplicity of methods. So here we have with us our very respected erudite scholar, Dr. Samir Kumar Das, who will illuminate us about the methodology for ethnographic research. Dr. Samir Kumar Das is a professor of political science and presently the director, Institute of Foreign Policy Studies at the University of Calcutta. Formerly Vice Chancellor of the University of North Bengal, Dean, Faculty of Arts, University of Calcutta, and Adjunct Professor of the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. He is presently the coordinator of the University Grant Commission Departmental Research Support Program on Democratic Governance, a postdoctoral fellow of the Social Science Research Council, and a visiting professor to the University 13 Sorbonne Paris site. He specializes in and writes on issues of ethnicity, security, migration, rights, justice, and democracy. So I'm handing over the session to Dr. Samir Kumar Das. All the participants are requested to mute themselves. The questions and queries will happen at the end of the session. So I hand over the session to Sir. Over to you, Sir.
Thank you. Can you show the slides, please? I've sent the slides to the college in the morning. All right, but let me begin by way of uh, thanking the college, Bahana College, uh, for having invited me to deliver a lecture on ethnography. I'm so glad to know that they have organized a series of lectures on ethnographic studies, which I think is absolutely essential for uh, understanding today's social science. Uh, I don't know whether the organizers can remember, but I have some fond memories of this college. I visited the college way back in 1999 when a national seminar was organized on parliamentary democracy, and I attended that national seminar as a young scholar. So I have all my memories about this college and uh, hope that I will get some opportunity of visiting the college in future as well. Uh, Let me, I don't know whether the slides can be shown, but in any case, you know that I will continue the discussion. Uh, I understand that this is the first lecture besides the keynote address which was delivered in the morning. Uh, Let me first of all tell you what I'm going to say and what my lecture is all about. It is basically on how ethnography as a research methodology has evolved over the years. If you ask me that this will be some sort of a 100-year evolution of ethnography as a research method. Uh, and I will explain why I will try to focus on the last 100 years and how it has evolved over the years. We can think of actually three stages in the evolution of ethnographic research. Uh, but before I come to the stages, let me first of all say a few words about what ethnography is all about. Uh, Ethnography, as you can understand, is a combined word. Uh, it's a combination of two words. One is ethnos. Ethnos, technically, it means a group which is bound together on the basis of some social criteria. For instance, it could be a language, it could be, for instance, religion, it could be, for instance, uh, a way of life. And you know that in India's northeast, way of life has a particular meaning, and I put it within quotes. The Naga demand for independence and for autonomy is built on the premise uh, of of a distinct way of life that the Nagas claim to have for themselves. So that's one part, ethnos. And the other part is graphy. Graphy actually means documentation. So when you talk about ethnography, it means documentation of any particular group or community. And then I sort of hasten to add, as accurately as possible. So documenting a group, a particular group or a particular community as accurately as possible. Now mark these words, as accurately as possible. In other words, a researcher is called upon to document a social group or a community in accurate terms. Uh, in other words, you know that his research should be as real as possible. So etymologically, ethnography, like I said, in some means the documentation of any particular group or community as accurately as possible, as I have already said. If you ask me that when did ethnography as a research methodology begin, I will say it is with the publication of Malinowski's famous work called Argonauts of the Western Pacific. I will give you the details of this reference at the end of our discussion. But Malinowski, all of you have heard the name of great anthropologist Malinowski. He's often described as, yes, I see someone has raised one's hand. I will request all of you to sort of wait till the end of my lecture, and I will, of course, listen to your comments, listen to your questions, and I will try to answer them at the end. Believe me, we will keep some time for discussion. So let me sort of take you back to Malinowski and the publication of his work, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. So this is a quite voluminous book, and it was published sometime in 1920, 22. I forgot exactly which year it was. So this was Malinowski's book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And you can say that that was the beginning of ethnography as a methodology of social research. Although I must say that there were other anthropologists before Malinowski who were doing ethnography without acknowledging or without devising this particular word, ethnography. So to my mind, Malinowski coined this word ethnography, and with the publication of this work, which I have just referred, ethnography began as a methodology of research. what was it that Malinowski was talking about? Uh, Malinowski, and let me read out a particular uh, sentence or a couple of sentences from Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Uh, uh, he says, for instance, and this is within quotes, ethnography consists mainly in cutting oneself off from the company of other white men. Uh, you know that by white men, he was basically talking about white man as an ethnographer who conducts his study, goes to the field, conducts his study on people who are certainly not whites. So basically, you know that it's ethnographers are a group of anthropologists who are basically whites, and they conduct their study in different parts of the world. Yes, now I can see it's coming out. So just let me, yes, this is Malinowski. So this was his period, 1884, 1942. And I'm exactly quoting from this particular sentence. This consists, I'm sorry, ethnography consists mainly in cutting oneself off from the company of other white men. By white men, we are referring to the anthropologists, because anthropology was basically a white man's discipline during that time. Uh, so, at one level, an anthropologist is required to cut himself off from the society, from the company of other white men, and remaining in as close contact with the natives meaning the objects of research, the people who are being investigated upon, uh, as possible, with the natives as possible, which really can only be achieved by camping right in their village. So you know that you can't do ethnographic work from outside. You will have to go to the village, see the field on your own, observe uh, whomever you are trying to work on. This was Malinowski. Uh, and his research methodology, which is, of course, ethnography, is known as participant observation. Why? Because if you want to observe, then you need to be a participant in the society which you are going to observe. That was exactly what he meant by ethnography. So, ethnography essentially implies participant observation. One is required to observe not from outside, but as part of the society, as a member of the society. That was one of Malinowski's fundamental propositions. Uh, Malinowski's, if one sort of turns to this voluminous book called Argonauts of the Western Pacific, you know that this is very interesting because it is written in the form of a travelogue. And all of us know that Malinowski was conducting his ethnographic research in some of the Polynesian islands during this time, during the late 1910s, 1918, 1920, 1922 is the publication, is the date of publication of this book that I'm referring to. He was conducting his research, and this book begins with a sentence which I keep remembering as long as I talk on ethnography. He says that, how do you feel when you see the ship that brought you to the island fading away in the distant ocean like a speck in the horizon? And then you suddenly realize that you are alone in an island. You are the only white man in an island, which is inhabited by the tribals whom you don't know. But you know for sure that for the next 6 years, you will be here as the only white man, and will be investigating, will be researching on these people of the island. That was Malinowski. So you know that this is, in other words, what I mean to say is this, that this was basically a long duration kind of research, a research which will consist of 6 years, 8 years. So this is very unlike the present day hit and run kind of research. You don't go in a dash and then sort of collect data, come back as soon as possible. No, an anthropologist is required to spend 5-6 years in the field all alone and then collect data and then should write on it. And next slide, please. So if you sort of read this particular sentence a bit carefully, then you can actually sort of focus on at least 4 preconditions of ethnographic research that he was talking about. And I will read them out. In fact, the next slide actually shows the preconditions. The first is what I will discuss. Yes, the first is what I will call shedding of preconceived ideas. So when you visit, for instance, the field, you are not required to carry with you all the stereotypes and the preconceived notions about the people. Now, let me give you an example. So when you, for instance, want to conduct your research, let's say amongst the Nagas, in the Naga inhabited areas of Nagaland, or even outside of Nagaland, then obviously such stereotypes as quote-unquote savages, primitives, which the British ethnographers used, or for instance, headhunters. So all these kinds of stereotypes must be discarded, because you know that you just cannot conduct research with all these stereotypes. You must sort of cleanse yourself of all these stereotypes. That was Malinowski's first piece of advice. The second is, he says that the contact with the field must not be sporadic, but it should be constant contact. So mark this word, that it cannot be sort of hit and run, sporadic, but it should be of constant nature. You should constantly be in touch with the field. The third is from strangeness to naturalness. In other words, if you are in contact with the society that you are researching on, then obviously you will become familiar with the members of the society. You become one of them. That's the important part, that you are no longer an outsider, you are no longer a stranger, but you become a part of them. And that's the reason why he says that why he uses the word participant, that you participate in the society like a member and you observe. So your observation is not from the perspective of an outsider. You become an insider to the society. In other words, a great transformation has to take place in the life of a researcher. He is no longer an outsider. He becomes an insider. So a white man stops remaining a white man. He becomes part of the society. He becomes an islander. He becomes a member of the society that he is researching on. And finally, number 4, his piece of advice is observance of the etiquette of the society that the anthropologist observes with possible occasional breaches. In other words, you have to, as you become a member of the society, you learn the etiquettes, the way, for instance, they behave, the way they eat, drink, for instance, the way they interact amongst themselves. You become familiar with everything. But then he says that it's possible that you may not have learned their way of life as vividly as vividly like them. So it's possible that there may be some exceptions, some violations of those etiquette. But then he again reminds us that those violations should not be of such magnitude that you are considered as an outsider in that society. So you get my point, that it's a transformation of an outsider, the anthropologist as an outsider, into the anthropologist as an insider of the society. So next slide, please. If you read it very carefully, read those 4 pieces of advice that Malinowski has for us, then obviously you know that there are two sets of criticism which are actually set against Malinowski. The first set of criticism is that when an outsider wants to become an insider, even if he has the best of intentions, can he really become the insider? So this is a big question mark. Suppose, I can give you an example. I have conducted a series of research. My PhD is on Assam movement, some of you know, and some of you may have been familiar with some of my writings. But then you know that ethnically I'm a Bengali. I wanted to become an insider to the Assamese society. I didn't have any problem, but the problem is that can I become 100% Assamese? Can an outsider become an 100% insider? I think that we need to make a distinction between being like the other and being the other. I think that I can be like the insider, but I cannot be the insider per se. So that becomes a problem. That there is always a remainder which can never be overcome, which can never be dissolved into the being of the insider. So you get my point, that there is always a distinction between being like the insider and being the insider. A researcher can only hope to be like the insider, but certainly not the insider. So that's one of the criticisms which we must keep in mind. The second criticism is that Malinowski assumes that culture is always homogeneous, one and indivisible. So when he says that you as an anthropologist, as an outsider, you become an insider, he assumes that there is one kind of culture I must assimilate myself into. But the problem is that the culture is multidimensional, multifaceted. It has many layers. What is it that I am going to assimilate into? I can assimilate myself into a particular layer, but that doesn't mean that I can assimilate into the culture, the entire culture of the society that I am researching on. So that becomes another problem, that which culture are we talking about? Which culture are we trying to become identified with? Now the problem is that Malinowski and other anthropologists, they basically worked on homogeneous tribal societies, which were not fragmented, which were not divided societies. But and those were basically secluded, isolated societies, remaining concentrated in some of the remoter regions of the world. Like I said, that this was basically the societies of the Polynesian islands. Basically, Polynesian islands consist of the islands which are close to the countries like New Zealand and Australia. That's where Malinowski conducted most of his researches. So those were isolated, secluded islands, and where people lived like a homogeneous community. But nowadays, societies are differentiated, stratified. There are multiple layers within the society. Think of the Assamese society, for instance. It is a multi-layered society. It consists of many communities, groups, and all of them have contributed to what is called the great Assamese culture. So this is a highly differentiated kind of society, and we are talking about differentiated societies across the world. So when Malinowski asks me to become a member of another society, which part of the society he is asking me to be a member of, that becomes a problem. Let me give you an example. And this is basically, for instance, when we talk about, let's say, a society, we also talk about, let's say, a society which is, for instance, divided between genders, for instance, the men and the women, the male and the female. That's the standard gender division of a society all of us are aware of. But what about the transgenders, for instance? And I particularly pick up the issue of transgenders precisely because you know that the transgenders are neither males nor females. It's an altogether different layer. And the transgenders are not an integral part of the society in the same sense in which, for instance, males and females are in the society. They live, for instance, within a community of their own, which we don't consider as part of the mainstream society. But on the other hand, you know that the transgenders, and I'm talking about the transgenders who are male to female transgenders, they consider themselves as women, although we know that even if they consider themselves as women, they are not the women. They are like the women, but certainly not the women. So this is the first part of the criticism of Malinowski, that we can be like the insiders, but certainly we will not be the insiders. We will never be taken as the insiders. And when you talk about the society that you are investigating on, and I'm coming to the second part of the criticism, then again you face the problem, the same problem. The problem is that, are you going to sort of become an insider of the transgender society or the society as a whole? Because culture is neither an indivisible whole, nor is it homogeneous. It's multi-layered. So that's about Malinowski. I would say that this is the stage of classical ethnography that we are talking about. A classical ethnography that was fathered and propounded by Bronislaw Malinowski. Let me come over to the second part. The next slide, please. And this began with the anthropological intervention of a great anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, whose picture is here on your screen. His time is between 1926 and 2006. And his famous book is Interpretation of Cultures, where he took ethnography as an interpretation. He defined ethnography as an interpretation, very unlike Malinowski. Because for Malinowski, ethnography is quote unquote accurate. That's the word I first mentioned when I initiated my discussion on ethnography. Accurate, why? Because your research must try to portray what is real, what is accurate. And Malinowski tried hard to sort of do away with the distinction between your research and reality. Because his idea was that it's possible to capture the reality through your research. And your research should be as real as possible. But see the departure that Clifford Geertz makes. Geertz says that ethnography is all about interpretation. Interpretation, why? Because what do you do when you interpret the society? You try to make sense of the society that you are trying to research on, conduct your research on. So it's a meaning seeking exercise. Remember this phrase, meaning seeking exercise. So how do you make sense of the way people behave? Make sense of, decipher, explain the behavior. So it's an anthropologist's interpretation of the society. And let me read out this particular paragraph because it's important, and then I will sort of cite an example. Geertz says, and this is a quote from from the book which was published in 1973, The Interpretation of Cultures, which is an epoch-making book. And when I first read it, I was quite amazed, and I read it long back. He says, and remember, he is defining ethnography. This is his definition of ethnography. He says the object of ethnography lies in a stratified hierarchy of meaningful structures. So you know that there is a structure of meanings in the society, in terms of which twitches meaning the muscular movements of your body, twitches, wings. All of us know wings meaning the movement of the eyelids, for instance. Fake wings meaning we pretend to wink, but it's not actually the wink. For instance, if someone, you know that when, for instance, you say something which you know that it's completely false, you tell somebody something which you know for sure that it's not true. So then what do? You blink as a signal to those who know that you are not telling the truth, asking them to stop. Parodies, rehearsals of parodies are produced. So, through these twitches, muscular movements, through wings, meaning the movement of your eyelids. So what is the meaning of all these things? How can you make sense of some of the wings that are produced through certain actions? Produced, perceived, and interpreted. Perceived and interpreted. You know that somebody winks at you and then you cannot understand the meaning of it. Then obviously then that wink has no meaning for you. That wink will have meaning for you to the extent that you can derive meaning from out of it. So you have to interpret the action of others. And therein lies the significance of ethnographic research. The ethnographic research is to derive meanings from out of the actions, from out of the behavior of others. And then he says, and without which, if you cannot derive meanings from out of the actions of others, from out of the behavior of others, then without which they would not in fact exist. So what is the meaning of wings? What is the meaning of twitches if you cannot understand the meaning of them? No matter what anyone did or didn't do with his eyelids. So even if I move my eyelids, if you don't understand what it means, then obviously you know that the action becomes absolutely meaningless. And that's the reason why Clifford Geertz always insists that ethnography is a meaning-seeking exercise. I will take a pause here and I will refer to an example. You know that in 2018, I guess that's all of you are aware of the example that I'm going to cite. In 2018, an actress of Kerala, and her name is Priya Prakash Warrior. She is known as the Queen of Wings. Why? Because her first film, which is called, if I can remember the words correctly, it's a Malayalam movie, which is called Oru Adar Love. So it's basically a love story. I haven't watched the movie, but I have watched Priya Prakash Warrior winking at a boy. So it's a classroom scene where the teacher is teaching, but then a boy is winking at a girl, and then the girl responds. And the role of the girl is being played by Priya Prakash Warrior. So it's a sort of transaction of meanings, exchange of meanings. The boy winking at the girl reciprocates, responds to this wink, and then you know that there is some sort of an agreement between the boy and the girl. It's like the boy falls in love with a girl, and that's how the love story unfolds. I guess that this part of the movie is still available on YouTube. And the wings were so famous that the girl became the Queen of Wings. Priya Prakash Warrior is, even today, she is described as the Queen of Wings. So wings as a way of conveying love to others is an example. But if, for instance, suppose the boy winks at the girl doesn't understand the meaning of the wink, then obviously there is no significance of the wink. So meaning, in other words, how do you define meaning? Meaning is an agreement between one who conveys and one who receives it. So unless there is a connection between the conveyor and the recipient, then obviously ethnography cannot be conducted. Ethnography loses its significance if there is no agreement. That's what Clifford Geertz has been talking about. So basically, you know that. Next slide, please. So basically, he was talking about. He was talking about ethnography as an interpretation. No, again, yes, ethnography as interpretation. Like I said, that it's a meaning-seeking act. So there, if you ask me, and if you ask me to sort of summarize Clifford Geertz's understanding of ethnography, then I will say that it stands on two legs. The first leg is seeking the meaning. Ethnography as seeking the meaning. As he says, I read it out. The thing to ask is what it is. Ridicule or challenge, irony or anger, snobbery or pride, that in their occurrence and through their agency is getting said. In other words, what is it that is being said through these acts that you have to derive? So that's one leg of Geertz's ethnography. And the second is, and which is very important, that Geertz warns us against understanding meanings as a one-off act. In other words, you know that he says that meanings are to be understood in terms of their sequence. And that's the reason why he says that ethnography is always an account. So if you understand the meaning of the wink, then obviously you know that you have to understand how wings are understood in the society, say during the last 100 years, and how, for instance, the meaning of wings may have undergone changes over the years. So ethnography is not a singular act. It's the observance of an act in its continuity with the past. And it has a future as well. So it comes, and that's the reason why Geertz always says that the most favorite word that comes with ethnography is account. You know that we always use this combined phrase called ethnographic accounts. I read out what he says. The ethnographer inscribes social discourse. Inscribes meaning that he actually imposes an account on how meanings are to be understood. He writes it down. So you write down an account, what it means, what is the kind of meaning which is being conveyed, what is the history of meanings. It has to be produced within a particular context. And you must remember that you don't always wink, or you don't sort of move your muscles everywhere. So it's within a particular context that an act acquires its meaning. That was Clifford Geertz. So this is what you can roughly call the second stage of ethnography. But then Geertz is also criticized, and there are two sets of criticisms which are leveled against Geertz. So let us move over to the next slide. Next slide, please. So you know that meanings are not made, they are made up. What does this mean? It means that within the society, an anthropologist has to try hard in order to make sense of what he is seeing. So he has to make up the meaning. It is the anthropologist's task to derive meaning, to make up the meaning. You know that meanings don't drop from the air. He has to make sense of it. I give you an example. For instance, you know that I don't know how many of you actually are from social science background, but I assume that most of you are from social science background, or maybe from the background of language and literature. And I'm referring to, for instance, the great book that was written by Edward Said. And I'm sure that all of you have heard the name of Edward Said. And I'm referring to the book, his famous book, Orientalism. Now, what is Said's argument in that book? He was basically referred to the societies which have been colonized by the European powers. And his argument was that in all these societies, the way, for instance, the people look at the world, and I'm talking about the colonized societies, the way, for instance, the people look at the world is through the lens of the colonial rulers. In other words, if I am colonized, I can't see the world on my own. I can see the world only through the lens of the colonial authorities. The way, for instance, they want me to understand the world. He described this phenomenon as Orientalism. He says that colonialism is not simply economic exploitation or political rule of the society. But it is something more. It is, for instance, a conquest of the mind of the colonized. The way, for instance, they conquer the mind of the colonized people. And it is for this reason, for instance, even after 75 years of our independence, we still try hard to speak in pure Assamese or in pure Bangla, for instance, or in pure mother tongue. We can't, precisely because that we have to resort to English words. Speaking in mother tongue for 1 hour becomes extremely difficult for each one of us, precisely because we have forgotten our mother tongue because of the intervention of English. So you get my point, that I look at the world, I observe the world through the lens that has been provided to me by the British colonial authorities. And we can't sort of separate us from that colonial mindset. This was what Edward Said described as Orientalism. He was, for instance, conducting his research on the Arab world. And all of us know that he was an Egypt-born famous literary critic who migrated to the United States and was teaching at Columbia University, died of cancer a few years back. But his famous book, Orientalism, is still regarded as the magnum opus on the post-colonial societies. So that how meanings are sought to be derived, how interpretations are devised, how you interpret the society. Is it yours? Or is it not derived from the colonial world? Isn't there a power play when you interpret a society? And you interpret the society not in the way you want to, but in the way, for instance, the colonial authorities have understood the world. The colonial rule has still sort of set forth the template of higher education in India. And we are still struggling hard to sort of grapple with it. So in other words, that what Geertz completely overlooked is the play of power. Because don't think that interpretation is always innocent and benign. Interpretation is also enmeshed in the power play that exists in the society. So that's the first set of criticisms which is leveled against Geertz. Let me come over to the second set of criticism. Ethnography turns into a seamless and monotonous interpretive exercise without acknowledging any conflict of interpretations. In other words, do we interpret the society in the same way, even if we are members of the same society? Isn't there a conflict of interpretations? The way you see the world is not exactly the way I see the world. Let me take you back to the example of Priya Prakash Warrior, the Queen of Wings. Now, Priya Prakash Warrior's movie, Oru Adar Love, became very famous, and it was, for instance, subtitled in Hindi and perhaps in Bengali as well. But then that a court case was slapped on her. Why? Because it was believed that by way of sort of winking, she hurt the sentiments of a religious community. So she, in other words, that what was a love story for her did not remain simply a love story. It was interpreted differently by a section of the society which looked upon it as hurtful to the sentiments of the religious minorities, because that's the way she allegedly insulted the Prophet. However, the Supreme Court dismissed the plea, and the court case could not be sustained. But the reason why I'm referring to it is this, that there is a conflict of interpretation. So the way you see the world is not exactly the way I see the world. And we are conflicting between ourselves. So that's the second kind of criticism. So how are we to take into account the conflict of interpretations? Now, for gears, there is only one way of understanding, for instance, the wings. There is only one possible interpretation of the wings and tweeches. But on the contrary, you know that wings are understood in all different ways by all different people at all different times, so on and so forth. So this marks the second stage. Now I will just make one point before I move over to the next slide, which is this, that for each stage I have sort of projected a great anthropologist. For the first stage, I projected Malinowski. For the second stage, I projected Clifford Geertz. But do not think that each stage is exhausted or can be exhausted with a simple reference to either Malinowski or Clifford Geertz. What I mean by Malinowski is a set of anthropologists were great descendants of Malinowski, and Malinowski's influence was absolutely powerful during his time. He dominated the scene when he was writing and when his books were coming out. On the other hand, you know that Clifford Geertz was an equally powerful anthropologist who influenced an entire generation of anthropologists. So by Malinowski, I don't mean a single person, but by Malinowski, I mean a number of people who were the descendants and disciples of Malinowski. Or by Clifford Geertz, I don't simply mean one single person, but by Clifford Geertz, I mean a whole generation of anthropologists who followed him. So let me move over to the third part, which I describe as C. So next slide, please. Here is this stage is marked by the intervention of James Clifford. Clifford is still alive, and he was born in 1945, as you see. And I will strongly recommend that all of you read the book that he edited, which is called Writing Culture, which is an epoch-making book. Now, you know that he exactly addresses the question of conflict of interpretations. Because for him, there is no one single interpretation, but many interpretations. Let me read it out, because this is a very important quote from the introduction of his book, Writing Culture. Like I said, that it's a volume, it's an edited volume edited by Clifford Geertz, which consists of a number of essays, including a few essays which were written by Clifford himself. I read out. Many voices clamor for expression. In other words, in society, you know that people always try to convey something. So in a society of ours, you know that all of us are actually jostling, fighting amongst ourselves to speak and to make others listen to me. Polyvocality was restrained and orchestrated in traditional ethnographers by giving to one voice a pervasive authoritative function. Authorial function. In other words, the polyvocality, it means what? It means multiplicity of expressions. So if all of us speak, now the favorite example that comes to my mind is the prime time evening talk shows on contemporary politics, whether in Assamese channels or in Bangla channels. You see a group of people fighting between themselves, shouting and shouting out each other, out shouting each other, so much so that you can hardly barely listen to anything. And they shout so much. The Bengali channels actually are shouting matches amongst these people. Now there was a time when I used to take part in these talk shows, but I have stopped going to those talk shows precisely because that I can't shout. And my voice is not all that cheap that I will shout and I will try to make others listen to what I say. What I mean to say is this, that many voices are fighting amongst themselves in order to make others listen to him or her. But that again there is the power play. So only a powerful voice can be listened, can be heard. All other voices will be shouted down. One who has the power will make others listen. The others will listen to the most powerful voice. Remember the word power. So it's all again power game. And one who has the power speaks a voice which is described as authorial. Authorial meaning that a voice which others can listen. Informants, to be quoted or paraphrased. Sorry, this is a continuation of the same sentence. So I will not sort of concentrate on it. I will pass on to the next sentence. Once dialogism and polyphony are recognized, dialogism means what? That I speak and as I speak, I expect you to listen to me with the clear understanding that as you speak, I also listen to you. That's the principle of dialogue. That dialogue does not mean simply speaking and shouting out others, out shouting others. But dialogue means what? Dialogue means speaking as well as listening. And many of us simply don't have listening literacy. We don't love to listen. We want to speak. So listening is the most important thing here. So he says and remember that listening makes the dialogue complete. Because dialogue consists of A, speaking, B, listening to others. So it's always, at the least, it's bilateral. You recognize the presence of the other. Remember that the emphasis for Clifford Geertz was on interpretation. But here the question is, whose interpretation? Am I supposed to stop listening to others? Or am I supposed to take cognizance of what others say? How they interpret? And how they interpret differently. The way I interpret is different from the way you interpret. Don't I have a responsibility for listening to what you say? And this becomes absolutely important. If I refuse to listen to you, the end result is violence. So violence begins when dialogue stops. And dialogue begins when violence stops. So when you refer to, for instance, the resurgence of conflict or violence in some parts of the Northeast, and you know what I am referring to, it means that the dialogue has come to a stop. It is because dialogue has come to a stop that violence has taken over. And violence reigns precisely because dialogue has come to a stop. And remember that when I talk about dialogue, I mean listening to others as well as speaking. So if you do not have patience to listen to others, then obviously no dialogue can take off. Once dialogism and polyphony meaning multiple voices, polyphony are recognized as modes of textual production. Monophonic authority is questioned. So until and unless your monophonic authority is questioned, until and unless if I speak on, and if I say, for instance, that I don't care to listen to you, then obviously that isn't that dictatorship, isn't that authoritarianism. So Clifford brings in democratic dialogue within the framework of ethnography. So now you can say that Clifford is the anthropologist who democratizes ethnography by way of bringing dialogue in. Once dialogism and polyphony are recognized as modes of textual production, monophonic authority is questioned, revealed to be a characteristic of a science that has claimed to represent cultures. In other words, until and unless you recognize the voices of others, until and unless you question the monophonic authority, phonic is the same word as phonetics. Monophonic, it means singular sound. So unless the singular sound is questioned, unless you bring in the multiple voices, then obviously you know that your authority, your ethnography is incomplete. So Clifford Geertz, in fact, focuses on the polyvocality, polyphonous character of ethnography. So next slide, please. So this is once again a quote from Clifford, and this is his famous book, Writing Culture, which came out in 1986. And you know that it's a very powerful book. And I strongly recommend that all of us read this book, precisely because you know that it has sort of influenced a whole generation of anthropologists. Ethnography is the study of making up, of inventing things not actually real. All constructed truths are made possible by powerful lies of exclusion and rhetoric. So you know that once again he was referring to the power game, and he says that when one meaning, one interpretation imposes itself on the society, you actually screen out a number of other possible interpretations. Screen out meaning you deselect, you do not take into cognizance other interpretations. So that's not ethnography, that's hegemony of one authorial interpretation. Authorial meaning that's the only probable interpretation which is imposed on one and all. But then ethnography for Clifford is an attempt at recovering the lost voices, the voices that are murdered, the voices that are killed, the voices that are not listened to, the voices that remain unheard. So that's what you do. You take into account what others say. All right, let me give you an example. I will take a little bit of time in order to illustrate this example, but I will make sure that we have some time for discussion, for questions and answers. Now, and this is a completely imaginary example, but please listen to this example very carefully. So, as I come over to deliver this lecture, and this is an absolutely imaginary example, and I keep reminding you of it uh, on and off. I I saw an accident taking place in front of my eyes. And the accident was something like this, that a huge truck carrying loads of luggage, loads of logs, for instance, entering into a kindergarten school, in the lawn of which you have 6 to 8 children who are playing in the field, who are playing in the lawn. And then the huge truck, it rammed into the kindergarten school and then killed all these 8 children. I said that this is an absolutely imaginary example. But as an ethnographer, I may be interested in it, in understanding it, that why did it happen? It could be, for instance, a mechanical failure of the lorry, of the truck that was carrying logs from the nearby forest. That could be one explanation. But I am no expert in in understanding the way, for instance, an engine functions. And since I'm no expert, so I cannot go into the details of the mechanical failure. But an engineer will be interested in understanding why did this machine fail? Or did the machine fail at all as it killed 8 children? So this will be the engineer's interpretation. The second, as an ethnographer, I will be interested in finding out if, for instance, the driver was black and the children playing in the kindergarten schools. And let's assume that this accident took place in the United States. And this is a lecture which is taking place in the United States. So I might be interested in discovering a racial angle to the whole thing. And it's possible that the driver was black and this was a kindergarten school which is mostly attended by the children of the whites. So you know that it's a black and white rivalry. And that's the reason why, for instance, it's a black driver's way of taking revenge. So that could be a second explanation. Remember that these descriptions, these ethnographic accounts become different from one another. But each of them could be very, very true. Or each of them could be true at the same time. The third explanation could be that the driver might have been drunk. He drank a lot and then thereby lost control over the machine. And that's the reason why the truck fell into the accident. The fourth explanation could be that in the morning, this truck driver had a quarrel with his wife. So he was in a sorry state of his mind. His mind was absolutely disturbed. And that's the reason why at this inadvertent moment, he ran into the accident. Now remember that the way you, for instance, produce this account is very important. How you can actually create this account, make it believable and credible to others. But each of these accounts is different from the other. So that's the third stage of ethnography. And uh, I, I will move over to the last slide. So next slide, please. I will just sort of familiarize you with some of the books which you may consult in this connection. The first is Max Weber's book. Now, you know that why Max Weber's book? Precisely because you know that Weber was no believer in ethnography. Weber never thought that ethnography would be a good way of conducting research, because he thought that social science research has to be objective, quote unquote. So you can begin with it. And then the second book is by Malinowski. This book came out in 1922, exactly 100 years before this lecture, and it was reprinted in 2013. Argonauts of the Western Pacific, an account of native adventures in the archipelagos of Melanesian New Guinea. So this book came out from London, and I have sort of marked out some pages because it's a voluminous book, pages 1 to 26. The next book is Clifford Geertz, which is marked by The Second Stage, came out in 1973. The Interpretation of Cultures. It came out from London. Again, I would strongly recommend that you read the first 28 pages of the book. It's the introduction, which actually tells you what ethnographic research as interpretation is all about. The third book is by Clifford, James Clifford. It came out in the year 1986. I'm sorry, this is the fourth book. Introduction, and the introduction is called Partial Truths. Why partial? Because you know that his argument is that all truths are partial. So when you make an ethnographic account, it cannot but be partial. It cannot be exhaustive. Like I said, that there are 3-4 ethnographic accounts which I have listed out when I described the accident. So this is a book which came out from University of California Press, Berkeley, in the year 1986. Dillon's book is optional. You may or may not read the book. The last is a paper which I wrote, and it came out in one of the journals which comes out from the Northeast, which comes out from Guwahati. It's called The Heritage. The title of it is Beyond Methods, Social Research as Experience. Although I must say that this is a paper which is not on ethnography, it's on experience. And why is it, I mean, the central argument is that why is it that research methods cannot capture experience? And why, for instance, understanding experience is much more important in social science. So thank you very much. We have some we have some time, for instance, to listen to you. I think we have 20 minutes time. I'm sorry I may have overshot my lecture by 8 to 10 minutes. I thought of sort of keeping half an hour for discussion. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, sir, for your enriching sessions. So, sir started with the meaning of the word ethnography, which is documenting a social group in accurate. And moreover, sir has also discussed the writings of various writers like Malinowski, then Geertz, then Edward Said, Orientalism. Thank you, sir. Now the session is open for discussion. You all can raise your hand and ask the question to sir in order. or you can just send us the question in the chat box. We can deliberate those. So, any questions? Participants are allowed to ask questions.
Participants, you can directly put your questions in the chat box, in the message box, or you may directly unmute yourself and ask your questions.
What I can give you some clue uh, while asking questions. I'm sure that many of you have been conducting your research, so you can share your research experience, whether it is a PhD level work or, for instance, post PhD level work. Uh, and you can ask me questions in the light of the kind of research that you have been doing, and how relevant ethnography is in the context of your research. All right. So you can share your experience as a researcher so that I can actually uh, hear you out, and I can tell you what, uh, oh, I mean, how ethnography could help you, if at all. There is one question which is from Somnath Pati. Let me read it out. I have one concern in my mind as you talked about the insider outsider debate. I feel that at times there are possibilities that the researchers themselves are an insider of the society they are researching upon. For example, a black individual researching upon and within his own community. Uh, now, you know that this is a very, very good question, and let me answer it. Uh, if you read, I mean, basically, let me first of all say that this is a uh, research method. I mean, ethnography is a research method which actually originated in anthropology, and that's the reason why I was referring constantly to anthropology, to the writings of the anthropologists. But then from anthropology, it traveled to many other disciplines like political science, sociology, so on and so forth, social philosophy as well, so on and so forth. So that's the reason why I was referring to the anthropologists, because ethnography has its origins in the uh, field of anthropology. Now, about your question, why do I refer to anthropology? Because anthropology, began as a discipline of the whites. The concern was to study the societies in all different parts of the world, and mostly remoter parts of the world, whether it's in Africa or it's in Southeast Asia, or it's in, for instance, the Polynesian islands, in this case, Melanesian islands. So in all these different areas, so who will conduct the research? Basically, the anthropologists from American universities, from the European universities. Who are they? They are whites. And what are the objects of their study? Basically, they are non-whites. Basically, the tribes living in Africa, in different parts of Africa, or living in, for instance, these Melanesian islands, or for instance, in different parts of Southeast Asia, in Bali, for instance, because Geertz's research is on Bali. So you get my point that there is a racial divide between an anthropologist and the field. All right. And that's the reason why Malinowski was constantly asking the anthropologists to be the insiders to the societies that they were working on. You get my point. Now, it is possible, for instance, for an insider to work on the insider. But when Malinowski was conducting his research, researchers, all of them, without any exception, were whites. But then you know that these societies were the non-white societies. Whether they are black, they are brown, or they are yellow is a different thing. But they were basically non-white societies. My point was that if you ask a white to become non-white while conducting one's research, a non-white can be like the white. I'm sorry, a white can be like the non-white. I'm so sorry. But then he or she can never be the white. He or she can never be the non-white. I'm so sorry. So let me sort of come again and let me once again explain that Malinowski asks a white researcher to be non-white. Why? Because his field is inhabited by or peopled by the non-whites. But a white can become the non-white up to a point. He cannot become a perfect non-white. And that's the reason why I say that he can be like the non-white, but certainly not the non-white. So there is always a distinction between being like the non-white and being the non-white. I gave you the example of transgenders. The point is that you know that a transgender, and particularly the male to female transgender, always wants to become a woman. But then can he or she become a woman? No. He can be like a woman, but certainly not the woman. Because, for instance, the women can bear children. He cannot. He can be like a woman. He can undergo a surgery by which, for instance, his sexuality can be reassigned. But then he can't be complete woman, so to say. So that's the reason why I made a distinction. But when an insider is conducting a research on the insider, the problem may not arise. But then you know that which insider are you talking about? That's my point. That's my concern. Because an insider for working on Indian societies, for instance, can be from India, but an insider who is an Indian can be from the United States, trying to conduct his research in India. So we can think of the insiders who by choice have become the outsiders. Ashish Nandi has used an expression, RNIs or resident non-Indians. They're Indians only by default. They live in India, but live in a cocooned world which is far off from the reality. So the insider-outsider distinction has also its many nuances, many layers, many levels. I don't know whether I could answer your question, but the question is very good and very pertinent.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have one more question from Sanchaita. She wants to know how we could use ethnographic methodology for the study of past culture and society of the most tribal communities of Assam, whose history has not been written. Because in today's context, it is hard to find the exact information. As with time, there has been changes. Sir, you can see the question on the screen.
I have seen the question and I would love to answer it. It's once again a very pertinent question because uh, remember that anthropology, I was talking about the history of origins of anthropology. Uh, the interesting point is that anthropologist comes from a society which has a culture of writing, but then he comes to a society which we describe as the field, where, for instance, the tradition of writing is not prevalent. So we don't write. So you know that the distinction between an anthropologist and his field is also a distinction between written culture and the unwritten culture. But then so your question can be answered in two different ways. One answer will come from those who will be influenced by Clifford Geertz. They will argue that let us listen uh, to those people and let us see how they can make sense of the world, their own behavior, for instance, how they understand what they try to understand, how they understand their behavior. Like I said, the wings and twitches, for instance. So I can go to a field, I can ask people, particularly the elderly people, whatever they can recollect and whatever they can make sense of. And remember that their cultural history has never been written, remains unwritten precisely because they don't have any writing tradition. Many of the tribes living in Assam do not have a script. Do not have a script. They may have a language, but they do not have a script. Till the other day, for instance, Meitei Lone, the Manipuri language was written in Bengali script. It continues to be written in Bengali script in some parts of Manipur. So you know that basically many of these traditions, many of these cultures have unwritten tradition. So what I can do is that I can go, I can ask them, I can record their versions, I can keep them. So that's the way you can understand the past culture. But then again, you know that there is a problem here. The problem, and there is a second answer to this, and second answer will come from those who will be influenced by James Clifford. And their answer to it is that no, let us dig out further and let us try to find out different understandings of their own culture and coming from all different sections of people. So there is no one interpretation of culture. There are multiple interpretations. And it's very important to recognize the multiplicity of voices, multiplicity of interpretations. So remember that an anthropologist's task is not to determine which one is authentic, is not to determine which one is true, but to recognize that all different interpretations are true. And that's the reason why the title of the chapter that Clifford wrote was partial truths, not complete truths, but partial truths. Truths are always partial. All right. And the moment you stop recognizing the partiality of truths, you will say, I know the truth, no one else knows it. And the result? The result is violence. The moment you say that I only know truth, and this is how my community has originated, then obviously you know that you hardly care to listen to others. And that's the recipe for violence. All right. So that's the reason why I have always been insisting. And that's the reason when, for instance, particularly those who are studying violence in different parts of the Northeast, I think that it is for them to, the Clifford's point is very important, that do not think that truth is partial. Always think that, do not think that truth is complete and perfect. Always think in terms of the partiality of truths. Thank you. It's a very pertinent question. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have one more question. Do ethnographic writing only use qualitative data?
The answer is yes. It's the shortest answer. Yes, there is. But if you ask me that whether you should not deal with quantitative data, my answer is no. You should deal with quantitative data. In other words, ethnographic research is not the be all and end all of research. There are other kinds of research as well, and the other kinds of research are as important. So what I will ask you to do is to apply all different kinds of research. Ethnography is just one of them. So when you depend on qualitative data, you may bring in, for instance, census data, quantitative data, sampling, for instance, so on and so forth. Do not think that ethnography is the be all and end all of research. Thank you.
Since we don't have any more questions, we can move to the end of today's session.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Samir Kumar Das once again for enlightening us about the trajectory of ethnography as methodology of research. I would like to thank the participants for their active support and cooperation. So, thank you. With this,
Thank
we
you.
end our today's session.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I'm just logging out. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.